You may have clicked on this video to find out what are the top 5 tanks of World War II, and I will deliver that. The question is how to define what are the top 5 tanks of World War II. What categories do you break it down into? Do I do the most all-rounded tanks of World War II? So something along the lines of Soviet T-34, German Panzer III, American Sherman, British Cromwell, and the Japanese Type 95 Ha-Go. These 5 tanks were the backbone tanks for their fighting forces, almost the equivalent of the main battle tank theory we have today: well-rounded protection, gun maneuverability, and reliability. Do I weight the top 5 list for what in theory were the top 5 tanks of World War II if you were to overlook logistics, weight constraints, and a whole host of other factors? Then the list could be the British Tortoise, the German Maus, the American T-95, the Soviet IS-7, and the American T-29. All of these tanks are heavyweights, as heavy as it gets. They pack large guns on heavily armoured hulls. Mobility and off-road speeds are not favourable. Keeping the vehicles in any running order on a mass scale would be a nightmare of logistics. Forget being able to cross any bridges with these tanks. The third way we can sort this list is what are the meme tanks of World War II? American T-40 Whizbang, Soviet SMK, Jagdpanzer 38T with a 150mm gun, Waffenträger Krupp with Pak 43, RBT-5. So where does that leave us? So many vehicles from World War II, and I can only put 5 of them on this list. We're going to put some of my own personal bias into this list to make it what are my top 5 tanks. Now wait a minute, I already did that. On the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, I did a top 5 list at the Tank Museum. Oh well, this is for my channel, plus I'm not limited to their collection. Like a lot of my top 5 lists, the vehicles on this list are fully constructed tanks that did see service. Paper designs like the P1000 and the E50 are not present on this list. Number 5. The Jagdtiger. What's a more powerful tank than a Tiger tank? A Tiger II. What's more heavily armoured and mounting a more powerful cannon? The Jagdtiger. There is around 1 billion downsides to this vehicle, so let's just pop them up on the shelf over here out of the way. The Jagdtiger's role was not to be a dedicated anti-tank vehicle, but to also be able to provide fire support by levelling strongpoints. Armour-wise, the hull was around the same as the Tiger II, with the hull extended just a little bit, 40cm. The new housing for the 12.8cm cannon had increased armour over the Tiger II standard turret. The new mounting had frontal-facing armour that was 250mm thick. The additional weight of the armour and the gun increased the combat weight of the Jagdtiger to be over 75 tons. The crew count from the regular Tiger was increased from 5 to 6. Around 75 to 85 Jagdtigers were completed, but not all of them were armed with the 12.8cm cannon. Issues with production of the cannon caused a substitute to be used instead. It is not known how many Jagdtigers were armed with the Pak 43 88mm cannon. The 2-piece ammunition for the 12.8cm cannon needed 2 loaders to load efficiently. Whether the 88mm equipped Jagdtiger still had 2 loaders would be interesting to know. The first Jagdtigers saw action in February 1945, having at best described as limited success, and that's putting it very politely. On paper, it looks like the vehicle's quite a menace, with almost indestructible frontal armour to all but the heaviest of Allied guns, be it tanks or stationary. It had a cannon that could obliterate strongpoints so enemy tanks in theory up to 8 km away. Realistically 4 km would be lucky. And when you look at the combat history of the Jagdtiger's performance, it is abysmal. You can chalk it up to Germany was losing the war. There were no chances to use them in their effective role. I think that's just a lazy excuse. Many of them didn't get to the front. Engine breakdowns, issues with transportation by rail, attacks from air by fighter bombers. Many were abandoned by their crews due to fuel shortages, and thus were blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. Although plenty were also not blown up, leading to a large number of them being captured. Crew performance could be described as comical. In the book Tigers in the Mud, there are some very interesting choices made by untrained crews.
I quickly grabbed one of my assault guns to give the enemy something to think about. I showed him the enemy and told him the distance, so nothing could really go wrong. The unfortunate man then made a fatal mistake. He didn't crank the cannon down to its right position until he had almost arrived on the high ground. Of course, the Americans heard the sound of the motor and reacted accordingly. 2 of the tanks scrammed, but the other 3 opened fire. The Stabsfeldwebel's vehicle was soon hit in the front and hadn't fired one shot itself. Instead of finally firing, the lunatic turned around on the high ground when he simply could have rolled backward. When the Yanks had the broadside of the hunting tiger in front of them, they let our vehicle have it. It immediately went up in flames. Other hits followed, and not one of the 6-man crew could save himself, probably because everyone got in each other's way. This example serves to prove that the best weapon and the greatest of enthusiasm are useless when thorough basic training has not been conducted.
For Jagdtiger's most major success was when 3 Jagdtigers knocked out 25 US tanks in an engagement. Let's just cover some of the Jagdtiger's shortcomings that we skimmed over earlier. The weight of the gun put a lot of strain on the traverse and elevation mechanisms. Going over uneven terrain, even slowly without the travel locks, would cause the gun to move around, damaging the traversal system. Trading a rotating turret for a fixed forward-facing gun that could only rotate 10 degrees horizontally left and right meant the transmission was under additional stress as the vehicle needed to point its hull at the target it needed to engage. Generally, the 12.8cm cannon was considered overkill, as it was not needed other than to engage any but the heaviest Soviet tanks. The resources that could have been used to build one Jagdtiger could have been spent effectively on other projects. Number 4. The KV-2. The KV-2 is a rather imposing tank. A large box-shaped turret mounted on a large chassis. It's almost as tall as it is wide. 3.25 meters tall and 3.3 meters wide. Armor is very impressive. 75mm all-round protection. The hull's front armor is 75mm, sides 75mm, rear 75mm, turret 75mm in all directions. The big feature of this tank is a 152mm howitzer. It took 6 men to crew the tank, 2 of which were dedicated loaders for the main gun. Soviet tankers nicknamed the KV-2 Dreadnought. Online, in the modern age, this vehicle has earned the nickname Derp Tank. You can see why it's earned both these names. For the Soviet tankers, it's as if a ship has taken to land in firepower and armor. For people that play online games, Derp Tank for its ability to normally delete whatever it engages with one hit. The vehicle was developed during the Soviet-Finnish War. It was noted that the KV-1 wasn't so good at destroying bunkers. The 76mm was just not cutting it. KV-1s had their turrets replaced with a new turret with a 152mm M10T howitzer. This early version of the KV-2 is different from the mass-produced later version. The 152mm cannon used 2-stage ammunition, with high explosive and armor-piercing shells available. The heavier shells weighed up to 52 kilograms. As expected, most targets engaged by the KV-2 would be lucky to remain unscathed. The armor and cannon were ahead of their time, especially when compared to the technology that the Germans were fielding for the invasion of the Soviet Union. The KV-2 was in production in 1939 and 1940, with the bulk of KV-2s being made in 1940. The Germans didn't have anti-tank weapons or tanks that were capable of penetrating the KV-1 or the KV-2. The largest dedicated German anti-tank weapons were the 37mm anti-tank gun and the Panzer III with the 50mm gun. The 37mm ended up earning the name by the Germans the door knocker due to its inability to penetrate enemy armour. There are many reports of KV-1s taking blow after blow from 20mm up to 50mm cannon fire. Infantry had to risk getting close enough to throw grenades, satchel charges and molotovs as a reliable means of disabling a KV tank. The only other reliable method of taking out a KV was with an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. The most famous KV-2 engagement was at Resania, where a single KV-2 held up 6th Panzer Division for several days by holding a key crossroads point. The KV-2's production run was ended when the Soviets were relocating their industry towards the Urals, October 1941. Industry was moved to the east to allow the factories to operate safely and unhindered from enemy bombing raids, and to prevent the factories from being overrun by the enemy. The final number of KV-2s produced is around 330. The KV-2, while impressive on paper, was not suitable for the mobile warfare of the era. When production of the KV-2 was stopped, the resources were used to make more T-34s instead. The sloped armour of the T-34 gave its relatively thin armour at 40mm good effective thickness. The KV-1 used the same cannon as the T-34, so it's easy to understand the switch from a more mobile tank over a heavy tank. Same gun, slightly worse armour, for much more mobility and cheaper cost per tank. That was a relatively good trade. The KV-2 had the same disadvantages of the KV-1, and had additional shortcomings. The extra weight of the KV-2 lowered the maximum speed for road and off-road capabilities. The poor engine and transmission had to cope with the additional 12 tons of weight, increasing the chance of breakdowns. The large profile of the KV made it an easy target to be engaged by anti-tank weapons. Remember, it's a giant box-shaped tank that stands over 3 meters tall. Other issues such as the KV-2's turret could not rotate on uneven surfaces. Best of all, for a tank that had such a large cannon, it had no indirect fire ability, so it couldn't be used as artillery or long-range fire support. Even after the KV-2 was cancelled, the spirit of the KV-2 lived on. KV-1 hulls continued to be produced. The KV-1S hull was united with a 152mm howitzer. Admittedly, not the same model. The KV-2 used the 152mm M10T howitzer, while the Su-152 used a more modern 152mm ML-20S. The Su-152 was designed to be a pillbox killer, a way to smash through German fortifications. Turned out that the Su-152 was a rather reliable way at killing German heavy tanks. Tigers, elephants and panthers. These could all be disabled by brute force of the large HE shells from the Su-152. Number 3. The M18, also known as the Hellcat. The M18 is a tank destroyer. What I find rather interesting is that its design is very different from other tank destroyers from the time. To be precise, I mean other nations. There were two main schools of thought when it came to German TDs. 1. A low-profile tank with a powerful gun and good forward armour, normally enclosed, for example the Jagdpanzer IV. 2. A tank or vehicle chassis with a powerful forward-facing gun with some light armoured plating, typically open-topped, for example the Nashorn. American doctrine made tank destroyers mobile with high speeds, powerful cannons in open-topped and turreted vehicles. The armour on these TDs was enough to stop small arms fire, and that's about it. American TDs were envisioned to be the cruiser class of ships to the land. The M18 is very nippy with a top speed of 80 km per hour. Rare for it to get to that speed, but even so, it was a very mobile tank. If compared to say the Jagdpanzer IV or the Nashorn, the Jagdpanzer IV has a top speed of 40 km per hour, the Nashorn 42 km per hour. Remember that it was unlikely for these vehicles to reach their top speeds in combat conditions. One question that I kind of skimmed past is why American tank doctrine was designed in such a way that American TDs were different from what was typically thought to be a TD. After France's defeat in World War II, the US forces had to rethink warfare. Setting up anti-tank artillery along a thin line to cover a front was an outdated idea. Warfare was becoming more mobile. The solution to prevent breakthroughs into American lines was to have a reactionary counterforce held in reserve. Once requested, the tank force could speed to wherever it was needed and engage the armoured threat. Now, those lovely tactics I just taught you, well, total garbage. In theory they are good, but in practice it was completely disregarded in the European theatre. The American TD theory was based around countering blitzkrieg, the German lightning warfare. The Germans would focus their armoured forces on a small section of the front. Once the front was broken, mobile divisions such as light tanks and motorised infantry would flood through the gap. Germany wasn't doing so good in 1944. Full-scale assaults across the Eastern Front from the Soviets, the occupation of Italy while also holding back for Allied landings in the southern half of Italy. Add to that D-Day and bam, there's a new front in France. Apart from a few large-scale counterattacks, blitzkrieg was dead. The Germans were on the defensive. Although I've referred to the M18 as a TD, it could be used as artillery when needed, either because there was no enemy armour to engage, or due to shortages with heavy artillery shells. The M18 could provide light artillery fire as a stopgap measure with its more common shells. This is a slight sidetrack, but being used as an artillery piece led to the unforeseen situation of cannon wear. Crews had to be trained on how to change their cannon barrels after they were worn out from overuse. An M10 battalion in Italy, late 1943, went through 15,000 HE shells in just 1 month. What's the M10? Well, to be frank, the M18 looks rather similar to the M10, and that's because the M18 was an evolution of the M10. The M10 had several issues, one being weight distribution. There was an urgency to get a tank destroyer into production, which meant that the M10's issues had to be addressed later. As production was underway, attention was given to some of these issues. One such issue being, the M10 cannon was rather heavy. This caused issues with the turret not being able to turn on uneven surfaces. Field modification proposals were put together and also alterations to the current production versions. By adding more weight to the rear of the turret, the weight on the turret ring would be more evenly distributed. While it did increase the overall weight of the vehicle, it was rather necessary. This is one of the reasons for the 50 cal on the M10. It's a tank destroyer. It didn't need a machine gun, but it was added anyway. It is placed near the rear of the turret for weight imbalance reasons. The M18 was lighter and faster than the M10, a well-executed evolution generally loved by its crews and recognised as being a well-balanced tank. Let's cover some of the good points about the M18, and one of them being it's open-topped. Open-topped vehicles have amazing visibility in all directions, well, when not under fire. All-round vision is important. There was a reason that the Germans glued a 360-degree vision cupola onto almost all of their tanks. Even some of the tanks that were captured had them added. In tank warfare, normally whoever got off the first shot won, so spotting the enemy first is crucial. Electric turret rotation. The M10 took over 80 seconds to do a full rotation, very slow. The M18 still had a hand crank, but now also an electric drive, significantly speeding up turret rotation. The gunner would use the electric drive to move the gun over a large traverse distance, and then make final adjustments with the hand crank. Anyway, enough about me singing praise for all its good points, let's cover some of the bad points too. One of them being that light German anti-tank guns could penetrate the armour easily. Even the obsolete 3.7cm gun could inflict damage to an M18. While being open-topped has all those advantages I mentioned earlier, it comes with its downsides too. Being open-topped meant the crew were vulnerable to light arms fire and artillery. Snipers or infantry could rain fire down on the crew who had no cover in their vehicle. In the firepower department, the M18 had a rather powerful gun, a 76mm cannon. It couldn't penetrate a Tiger or a Panther from the front. However, life isn't a video game, and a few shots to the front of the turret would cripple a heavy German Cat. The M36 is closer to a redesign of the M10 rather than an evolution of the Hellcat, packing a 90mm gun to better cope with dealing with those German heavy cats head-on. In the anti-infantry department, the M18 is not so good. The only secondary weapon was a 50 cal for the commander. No hull machine gun or coaxial. So things could get a bit tricky with enemy infantry getting close. Right then, that's enough me talking about the M18, let's move on to the next vehicle.
This is Bismarck to Kriegsmarine headquarters. I'm trying to sneak around, but the clap of my 38cm cannons has alerted the Royal Navy. We have sunk HMS Hood. All is well. We are heading to France and will soon be in range of shore-based aircraft.
We got incoming torpedo bombers on the radar. Oh, nein. Nothing to worry about. They are just biplanes.
If only the Germans knew we cracked their secret codes. They should have taken more care of their communication security. Maybe had something stronger than the Enigma code. If only the Kriegsmarine had ExpressVPN. If the Kriegsmarine had been using ExpressVPN, their transmission would have been secured and we wouldn't have been able to eavesdrop on their personal data. So what is a VPN and why do you need it? Well, I'm glad you asked, because a VPN, or Virtual Private Network, is a secure channel between your device and the internet. With ExpressVPN, you can make sure that you browse the web safely and securely. ExpressVPN masks your IP address and lets you connect to servers in over 94 different countries, so you can appear to be browsing from anywhere in the world. Why would you want to do this? You can use ExpressVPN to browse region-locked content in other countries by simply changing what country you want to connect to. I used ExpressVPN for the extra security when connected to public Wi-Fi when I was in and out of coffee shops writing up the script for this video. This is because ExpressVPN encrypts your data. All this and more for $7 a month, with a 30-day money-back guarantee if for some reason you are unhappy with the service. Take back your internet privacy today and find out how you can get 3 months free by clicking on the link in the description box below. expressvpn.com/IronArmenian. Take back your privacy today with ExpressVPN. And now back to your regularly scheduled content. Number 2. The 10.5cm Aufgeschutzwagen B2F. 1941. France has capitulated. Throughout the country lies leftover gear from the French Army and the British BEF, British Expeditionary Force. Some of this equipment were tanks. To the Germans, these were referred to as trophy tanks. There was only one tank made by the French that truly gave the Germans trouble. The Char B. A French heavy tank. It has 2 cannons, a 75mm howitzer facing forward in the hull, and a 47mm in a rotating turret. The armour was rather impressive, with forward-facing armour being 60mm thick, basically impenetrable to the German 2cm and 3.7cm cannons. While the tank did have several issues, such as only having a 4-man crew, thus making the vehicle not effective, Most of them were disabled by logistic issues rather than knocked out in action. 161 Char Bs were captured intact, of which 125 Char Bs were put back into service for the Germans. Orders from Hitler were to press the vehicles back into service again. They were to undergo some modifications. Some of the Char Bs were refitted with flamethrowers. Others would replace the main turret with a 10.5cm artillery gun, the 10.5cm LE FH-18. The Geschützwagen B2F had a custom turret designed for the 10.5cm gun. The turret was open-topped with armor plating on the front and sides. The hull gun was removed, with the space being used for additional ammo storage and a radio. In total, 16 Char Bs were converted to this setup. The 10.5cm cannon was mainly used for firing HE shells over long distances. While it could fire AP rounds and be used in direct fire, it wasn't very suitable for this role. The cannon lacked enough penetration to even be useful against a T-34. I'm not sure about the performance of these 16 converted tanks, or their ultimate fate. Different sources seem to conflict on where the tanks were sent. What I don't understand is why convert a heavy tank to be nothing short of a vehicle for transporting an artillery gun. Unlike other German self-propelled guns, the Char B was slow. The point of an SPG was to be mobile, and the Char B most certainly wasn't. SPGs also tend to be mounted on reliable vehicles. The Char B was not mechanically reliable, and also getting spare parts was difficult. I can understand the conversion of the flamethrower Char Bs. Flammingwagen auf Panzerkampfwagen B2F. The Char B had relatively thick frontal armor, at least tougher than what the Germans were fielding at the time. The Char B could stroll up to a strong point and then use its close-range weapon to clear the position. 60 Flame Char Bs were made. Apparently they didn't do so good as they weren't mechanically reliable enough to even get to their targets. Number 1. The Jagdpanzer 38T, also known as the Hetzer. There's two things I need to clear up before diving into this section. One of them is that the term Hetzer is a post-war term. Different stories argue where the term Hetzer originated. For one thing they mostly agree on, is that Hetzer is a post-war name. I will say it's a lot easier to say Hetzer than Jagdpanzer 38T when referencing this vehicle. The second thing that I need to clean up is these two terms, Jagdpanzer and Panzerjäger. Jagdpanzer, hunting tank, refers to a turretless tank with an anti-tank gun fitted in the hull, typically enclosed and heavily armoured. Panzerjäger, tank hunter, refers to a turretless tank fitted with an anti-tank gun, typically open-topped and very lightly armoured. The reason I brought this up is because the Jagdpanzer 38T refers to this, whereas the Panzerjäger 38 would be this, the Marder 3. With that cleared up, let's dive into this small tank. Good speed, powerful gun, adequate armour to protect the crew, the Jagdpanzer 38T was a drastic change in late war German tank design. A cheap and cheerful tank was needed. The enemy had the numbers, and the heavy tanks such as the Panthers and Tigers were just not available in the quantities needed to be impactful. Cheap and cheerful was needed. A new twist in the formula of TDs was to use a light tank hull and refine it. Normally, light tanks converted into TDs were Panzerjägers. The Hetzer used a light tank hull but had thick frontal armour, 60mm facing forward, angled very steeply, 60 degrees on the upper plate and 40 on the lower. The front armour gave it protection from most enemy tanks at medium ranges. The sides and rear were where the armour was weakest. It was sloped, yet it was so thin that it could be penetrated even by anti-tank rifles, which had been considered obsolete. The tank was designed and entered into mass production in only 4 months. This was due to the 38T being based on the Czech-Slovak 38T. The mechanics behind the tank were already proven. The gun was the 7.5cm Pak 39, already tested and proven. The Jagdpanzer 38T was proposed as a solution to increase the number of Jagdpanzers. The only Jagdpanzer in production was the Jagdpanzer 4. The OKH, Army High Command, proposed a new light Jagdpanzer, as the factory they had in mind for producing more Jagdpanzers wasn't capable of making medium-sized tanks. The original specifications for this new tank destroyer were that it had to weigh a maximum of 13 tons, be able to mount a 7.5cm gun, which should be able to traverse 15 degrees right and left, have a top speed of 60 km per hour, have frontal armor strong enough to stop most anti-tank guns. Some very demanding criteria. The final combat weight of the 38T was near 17 tons. Top speed at best on road was 40 km per hour and 15 off-road. On the Stug, the gun could rotate 10 degrees left and right of the hull. In the Jagdpanzer 38T, it was 5 degrees left and 11 degrees to the right. The 7.5cm cannon ideally would have been mounted in the middle, but couldn't be. The gun had to be mounted on the right hand side of the vehicle. That caused issues with traverse. The small arc of fire meant that the Hetzer had to be almost pointing directly at the target it wanted to engage. The Jagdpanzer's poor drivetrain was prone to failing, due to being forward heavy and 3 tons over design specified weight. The issues with the drivetrain were addressed in the later variants, and small adjustments were made so the vehicle was less forward heavy. Over 3,000 Jagdpanzer 38Ts were made in the last 2 years of the war. With mass production starting in March 1944, it had a production run of just barely over 1 year. Funny to me, at least not the crews of this, was that the gun was designed to be loaded from the right, but the gunner and loader sat to the left of the gun, making it very difficult to operate. This was not helped by the crampedness of the crew compartment. 4 men would be squeezed into this very tight space. Visibility out of the vehicle wasn't too good. The commander had to observe outside of the tank most of the time. Must have not been very nice operating the Jagdpanzer 38. One feature that was liked by crews was a remote control machine gun. Well, a machine gun operated by a stick from within the vehicle. It had a periscope so the user could see the target they were aiming for, and it could turn 360 degrees. The machine gun was operated by the loader and used 50 round magazines. Once the ammo was out, someone needed to go outside of the tank and reload the gun. We can't discuss the Hetzer without some of the unusual variants. One being a light recovery vehicle used for carrying recovery equipment. Later variants had thinner armour and were fitted with a spade attachment. It had no main gun and around 170 of this variant were made. This variant is basically a 15cm cannon glued onto a Hetzer chassis. Around 30 were made, although there is debate if they saw action or if even 30 of them were built. Well, one of them was definitely built, it's just question whether 30 were actually completed. Flammenpanzer 38. A flamethrower was installed inside a pipe disguised to look like a 75mm cannon. 50 of this variant were made. Some of them saw action in the Ardennes offensive. This small tank destroyer that was under 1.8 meters tall proved a perfect ambushing tank, which was what Germany needed. A good gun strapped to a relatively reliable tank hull, easy to hide from aerial and ground recon, and yet fast enough to be able to plug a breakthrough attempt. The 75mm gun could handle enemy medium tanks and even possibly heavy tanks with side shots at close ranges. The Jagdpanzer 38T was an all-round nightmare for its crews and for the tanks it went up against. So there you have it. Those are my top 5 tanks of World War II. This list is purely subjective and you, the viewer, may have your own idea of what the top 5 tanks are. If you've gotten this far in the video, leave in the comment section below what are your top 5 tanks of World War II. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.